Welcome to Housmans, and an evening focusing on a timely and acclaimed new edited volume, Transgender Marxism, published by Pluto. Now, this is the first collection of its kind. Transgender Marxism is a groundbreaking union of transgender studies and Marxist theory. It explores trans lives and movements from Lancaster to Brazil, and it takes in Deleuze and dystopias along the way. So the contributors to this book explore the pressures and oppression faced by trans people living in capitalist societies and the damage done by their tenuous position in the workplace and the home. So our speakers tonight, I'm so pleased to say, are the book's editors, Jules Joanne Gleeson and Elle. And we also have one of its contributors, Nat Raha, with us this evening. And I'm really delighted to say that our chair tonight is Shon Faye. So Jules Joanne Gleeson is a writer, comedian, and historian. She's published essays in outlets including Viewpoint Magazine, Invert Journal and VICE, and performed internationally at a wide range of communist and queer cultural events. Elle is a political economist and gender theorist, and she's currently researching critical theories of financialization. She's co-founder of New Socialist, a magazine of left thought and commentary, where she's economics co-editor. Nat Raha is a poet based in Edinburgh who completed a PhD at the University of Sussex entitled Queer Capital, Marxism in Queer Theory and Post-1950 Poetics. She's the author of 3 collections and numerous pamphlets of poetry, and her current research focuses on radical transfeminism and race in UK poetry and poetics. Nat is also co-editor of the Radical Transfeminism zine. Shon Faye, our chair, trained as a lawyer and then left the law to pursue writing and campaigning, working in the charity sector with Amnesty International and Stonewall, and has also been an editor-at-large at Dazed. She recently launched a podcast series that I can highly recommend, Call Me Mother, interviewing trailblazing LGBTQ elders. And her first book, which we hope we will see very soon on the shelves of Housmans, The Transgender Issue, will be published by Penguin in September. So thank you for joining us virtually at Housmans, a proudly independent bookshop whose doors first opened in 1945, and we've been based in King's Cross in London since 1959. We specialize in books, magazines, and periodicals of radical interest and progressive politics, focusing on subjects such as feminism, Black politics and identity, LGBTQIA perspectives, the environment, socialism, and anarchism. Some of you may know we reopened to the public in April after a year spent selling a whole lot of books by mail order to people all over the world. And while our doors are open now, our mail order business is still in operation too. So if you can't come in to see us in person, we invite you to order your copy of Transgender Marxism at www.housmans.com. So this evening, which is going to start in just a minute or two, is part of our ongoing program of events. And I'd really like to recommend our event on the 30th of June, The Revenge of the Real, Politics for a Post-Pandemic World, featuring Benjamin Bratton in conversation with Nick Cernacek. So tonight, our event will run until about 8:30 UK time. And once I disappear, our speakers and chair will get stuck into conversation. And before the night is out, they will be engaging with the always excellent questions from our Housmans audience. That's you. So if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A box. You know the drill now. The Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's the Q&A box, not the chat box. And our speakers and chair will do their best to get to as many of your queries and contributions as they can. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And over to you, Jules, Elle, Nat, and Shon.
Thank you. I'd just like to say thank you to Housmans for having us. And I just want to say on a personal note how excited I am to be chairing this event this evening. All the panelists are people whose work I've been aware of for several years. We were just saying before we started that I don't think all of us, so certainly I haven't met any of the panelists in real life, but have been in the same online spaces as them for years. Their work has certainly influenced my own. I'm pretty sure I've directly referenced all of them at some point or another. And learned a lot from them, and I'm sure you will this evening as well. I think this is this book is a really important intervention in the time in which we're living with. I think it's worth saying, and I want to kind of express right at the start of this event, solidarity with our siblings in Hungary after the announcement today of Viktor Orban's Fidesz party with more restrictive laws on LGBTQ life for trans and queer people in Hungary, with restrictions on promotion of LGBTQ issues in schools and on kids' TVs. And that's yet another move in that government's clampdown on trans life, trans freedom, particularly since the coronavirus pandemic began. And it's a mindful start, really, of the growing preponderance of transphobia, in particular on the far right in Europe and in America. And sadly, too, as I'm sure we'll get onto, in Britain, and not always as well purely on the far right, but creeping antagonism towards trans lives and trans liberation in liberal spaces and occasionally sometimes left-wing spaces. So a leftist response to that threat at these times, I think, is really crucial, and the conceptual tools in which to be able to kind of situate trans politics on the left and within a kind of wider cause of liberation and socialist Marxist politics is really important. And so I'm really keen to ask the panelists more about that. And I think I'm going to begin with Jules, and to pretty much just ask Jules if she feels kind of comfortable explaining how the book came about, what you wanted to do with the book, and yeah, take us from there, really.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction, Shon. That was really wonderful. And likewise, I'm quite honoured to be both talking to you and also in front of the Housmans audience, because I personally have visited Housmans for quite some time. I haven't been based in London since 2013, but I recall in my teenage years when I was living in the city, there was this great excitement every time I visited, especially the basement, where you'd find everything from anti-imperialist critiques of the Observer to like primitivist tracts which were held together by string as their binding. There was all kinds of things in their secondhand basement. I'm not sure if that's still there anymore, but this is a very fond memory of my introduction to revolutionary politics. So very nice to be with you. So concerning this book, so my brief is kind of just to talk about how this book came about. So originally this was suggested to me. I'm glad to hear it's still there. Originally this was a collection which was conceived in 2018. We decided, myself and Elle decided that this was something which we wanted to do as a collaborative project. We'd already been approached by Pluto Press, who are the publisher, about putting something of this nature together, although they had given us quite a vague brief. That was kind of like they were happy to publish whatever we were going to come up with. But the reason we took this approach, so the final book, which I've got here, is this 305 pages, which contains pretty much exclusively original essays, with one exception. There's one rewritten one in there. But the main body of the book are 14 essays, and then an introduction by myself and Elle, and then an afterword by Geordie Rosenberg. And the reason we took this approach was that we were very keen on having a polyphonic scope, a sort of multi-voice approach towards transgender Marxism, especially because a shared frustration of myself and Elle is that very often in these spaces, even in the relatively friendly left-wing spaces, there was often this approach that transgender theorization was something which would occur in the register of critique. You would have like some transgender member of a group, and they would present their ideas and put together their thoughts, and basically have to do several things at once. They would have to talk about the left, they would have to talk about Marx, they would have to talk about their own experiences and so on. They'd have to kind of perform this juggling act. And that's something which we wanted to sort of move well beyond, which is something which I think bringing so many different theorists with various identifications and various locations and positions together, bringing them together sort of allowed us to move well beyond that, and especially to allow each chapter in the book to sort of take up its own thematic or focused approach. So it was very important to us that no one contributing sort of had this role of serving as a representative of their given gender position or geographical location, or even of their intellectual tradition. So this is something which we wanted to leave space for, but also not something which we wanted to require or oblige anyone contributing to do. So as a consequence, kind of, we've got people who both have come to their transgender experiences or who have like approached these questions to do with gender in very different ways, and also people who've come to Marxism in very different ways and from very different traditions in very different contexts and so on. And I suppose I'll probably just read out a little snippet from our introduction, which myself and Elle kind of put together to try and thread together these wide array of strands. So what we write here is, as much as any feature of Marx's life and work itself, what has surely drawn many trans theorists towards Marxism is frustration at what we might call the mainstream of trans activism, as strange a notion as this may seem to many. From the reluctance of many organizations either to think beyond the state and the NGO complex, or those groups self-styled as communities which are clearly riven with the divided class positions and interests of their participants. Too often we have found ourselves expected to set aside questions of exploitation or modes of production, and to quiet that part of ourselves which might detect any differentiation within our commonality. The consequence here is always the same. It will always require a dose of bad faith to maintain the conceit that all transgender people share precisely the same interests. For all the global right wing's panicked insistence, states' willingness to tolerate our presence indicates a seismic rift in the course of history. In reality, whatever minor breakthroughs we win will pose no threat to the much sturdier relations of exploitation on which society rests. In this context, Marxism alone can offer explanations that prevent this inevitable burnout from backsliding into mere cynicism. It can reorient ourselves away from liberal optimism and the predictable shocks that follow on from it. It directs us against the state and the naturalization of human exploitation. And at times it can direct us away from Marx himself. So this is sort of roughly what we were trying to get at. And I think this is what all of the different contributions, this is what I think all of the different contributions sort of share in one respect or another. Now I can kind of like run through the individual chapters if you want, but also there's 14 of them. So maybe I should just pass over to Elle. What do you think?
I mean, I think it's probably useful to pass over to Elle. What I would say is I just wanted to kind of, I just wanted to pick up on that really, is perhaps for people who are watching who are unaware really, I think is that perhaps particularly in Britain, where probably most people are watching from, is some of what you described there is kind of where you say like a trans liberalism, maybe the one that's pushed by NGOs. So, you know, in recent weeks, for example, Stonewall, where, as they mentioned in the introduction, I have worked. I'm trying to be just as diplomatic as possible. Obviously that there are, that there is a certain kind of focus on what the aims of trans politics is and what trans people want. And your argument is essentially that you can't kind of ratify into this kind of liberal, we just want to be recognized by the state. Is that kind of the gist?
Yeah, let me just say a word on that concerning the British situation, which is quite remarkable at this point, because Stonewall, this organization you mentioned, has sort of only been concerned with trans issues since 2015, but already there seems that the fact that they're concerning themselves with emancipatory politics towards that minority group has really transformed the sort of whole landscape very quickly. So concerning the British situation, well, Nat Raha, who's with us this evening, wrote this remarkable essay on trans liberalism back in 2015. And what I would describe the last, probably since 2017, we've seen this sort of free-falling collapse of any sort of trans liberal politics. As increasingly there's been this very rapid march of transphobic feminism in particular through these liberal institutions. So when I say liberal institutions, I mean on the right wing, you have sort of the Times and the Economist. Sort of more towards the lefty liberal side, you have the Guardian, obviously, and then the New Statesman, and you could name anything else. And then also the sort of high establishment. So Professor Kathleen Stocks getting awarded an OBE, so getting a medal from the Queen, basically, while sort of decrying cancel culture. It's sort of an exemplary issue in this effect. So we're seeing this sort of mobilization of simultaneously kind of transphobic feminism and also a sort of free speech Toryism, which is defining itself against wokeness and cancel culture and whatever else, which has sort of pushed any prospects of civic emancipation for British trans people sort of out of the horizon for the time being. And I think what I would try and get at here, and this is probably not a major concern of the book, actually. Not much of the book is about transphobic feminism. It has to be said, there are certain essays which deal with it in passing. But I guess my point here would be is that the sort of the flawed assumption in transliberalism, specifically that trans people, we could fashion ourselves as a minority that would then be able to be emancipated in a straightforward way. So we'd be a minority and we could educate people about our plight, and then this would sort of lead through to a benign outcome. Whereas the reality is anyone who's considered the history of the British state would know that really the British state has a much more ambivalent reaction to minorities. It's always happiest when it's setting them against each other, rather than benignly sort of identifying plights and resolving them. So when we're looking at the whole evangelical funded setting of LGB against T and stuff like that, this is really simultaneously something which is very new and very troubling, but also it's sort of there's a continuity between the earlier behavior of the British state and what we're seeing now. So that's what I've got to say. But I think I should be quiet for a while.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for taking a kind of spontaneous follow-up question. I'll come to Elle, who I think is going to just explain a little bit more about the kind of theoretical foundations of the book and kind of what its intentions were in that respect. And so, yeah, I'll just hand over to Elle.
Thank you, Shon. Thank you for hosting, and thank you for Housmans for hosting us as well. I think the last time I was there was just before the pandemic with Jules, actually, and I picked up Samir Amin, who I really love, in the basement, which was great. So I'm going to talk about the book, the theoretical aims of the book, give you a sort of context and a contextualization of many of the themes, recurring arguments within the book. So why transgender Marxism? Well, how does transgender Marxism fit into socialist modes of thought and socialist politics more broadly? It would be impossible to speak about gender politics this past decade without an account of the cultural space that trans people and trans issues seem to occupy as a source of political contestation at the moment, either as figures of celebration or demonization, and with it the increasingly assertive transgender politics, challenging received assumptions about who, what, and how gender is to be lived, embodied, and negotiated. Trans people have carved out a space for themselves in wider society in a way that would have been difficult to imagine just a few short decades ago. More and more trans people are finding space and opportunity to express their joys, to have their needs met, to find love and pleasure in ways that would have been more marginalized and confined to more hidden corners of society. Simply put, there seem to be more of us around lately. Alongside this, there has been an attempt to apprehend in thought these profound changes in real time, a sort of radical resurgence of trans feminism on zines and blogs as all sorts of cultural spaces, because as with many a radical in previous generations who have found themselves approaching this daunting task anew, kind of attempting to understand their own conditions, the better to change them. So this is kind of not a new sort of thing. Since the original publication of Capital, debate has raged about how thoroughgoing or adequate Marxist deconstruction of capitalist social forms actually is, sparked by a certain ambivalence in Marx's own project and his own orientation and his own understanding of the world. While his intention was to historicize the social construction of all legal social categories as matters of property, capital, and class domination, to what extent is Marx's critique also a foreshortened critique? How different would Marx's account of the rosy dawn of industrial society have been if he made Liverpool rather than Manchester, his home in exile, the source of maritime transport and global domination rather than the home of the industrial factory, or if his dispatches to the New York Daily Tribune on the convulsions of the money markets on Lombard Street, driven by disturbances on the European continent, were instead dispatches to the Manchester Guardian about the travails of Wall Street, driven by tremors on the plantations and the slave-dealing markets of America's cotton frontier, or if he had seen the employment of women in industry not as a recent and emasculating phenomena, which he does in certain parts of Capital, a sort of general law of capitalist development emerging from the advance of the factory system and mechanization, where men's labor is replaced by women's labor, and it's degrading for all involved, but a more complex and long-term trend in social industrial history where women were present throughout, which they were. or if you had seen the very dynamics driving a thoroughgoing transformation in industry and the world of work, were also reshaping the other hidden abode, the private household, in equally dramatic ways. Or if he had focused his lens not on the relations within Lancashire's cotton mills, but on the sugar plantations of Europe's tropical colonies. So transgender Marxism sits in a long line of elaborations and novel extensions of Marxist thought, where others sort of see contradiction, incoherence, or illicit distortion. How can there be a transgender Marxism of all things? We see no incongruity at all. So when it comes to debates on identity thinking, identity politics, and their so-called indissolubility with questions of class, we do not really recognize the accounts of Marxism that suggest Marxism is indifferent to the messy sensuousness of human affairs, the reality of social distinctions, and how capital transforms these descriptive distinctions into a material force. So for our part, when we're beginning to focus on to work on the book, key to our agenda was ensuring that trans life itself comes into focus. So we were opposed to this sort of entrenchment of a transcendent principle of trans that comes to obscure the particular struggles that trans people face as they attempt to survive in the face of capitalism. So trans people already occupy an awkward space in social theory and Marxist politics. The main currents of Marxism and feminism have largely done a disservice to trans identities, not so much an unhappy marriage as a yawning gulf of indifference, often gesturing towards trans people, then proceeding to write the sort of feminist theorizing they wish to write anyway. Or to take a recent example, in Silvia Federici's recent book, we're placed alongside plastic surgery and surrogacy as examples of fiendish capitalist body modification practices that go too far. So when not actively vilified or included as a polite footnote, many assume an interest in trans people thanks to our marginalization, as we are more likely to experience poverty, destitution, engage in sex work, experience abuse and mistreatment by wider society, the police and the criminal justice system. We tend to be more radical than the general population, and thus a special source of interest. In particular, because we occupy a sort of liminal or perhaps an ambiguous space in the gender order, we are taken to embody, or at least provoke, a sort of space of subversion and rebellion, one that can perhaps shake existing society out of its complacency vis-a-vis sex and gender, a gender vanguardism of sorts. So the upshot of this is that trans people are perhaps a useful source of recruits, a fashionable cause to follow, and sotto voce, bearers of a special responsibility. So as an account of trans life and trans and queer life, this auxiliary argument is precisely negative. We are of note due to our suffering, and by dint of our stigmatization and its travails, little space is left for the actual substance of trans life, the experiences surviving in the context of separation that we already share among ourselves, and the resultant insights for a broader and refreshed view of capitalism's reproduction. But this is hardly an unprecedented theoretical maneuver. Emma Heaney, in her book, The New Woman, has shown that throughout modern history, trans women find themselves and their experiences represented always as an allegory for something else. Rather than being treated on their own terms, trans women often serve as the theoretical raw material to ground the universality of cis experience. Heaney traces this across the late 19th and 20th century representations of trans femininity, including in sexology literature, modernist fiction and social theory. Literary modernism is replete with examples of trans women as these sort of metaphorical figures for the destabilization of inherited gender traditions, stand-ins for broader destabilizations brought about by urbanization, suffrage, and women entering new roles in the workforce, and with it these sort of attendant anxieties about masculine self-assurance and patriarchal right as it is being challenged. In other accounts, transgender experiences serve as an example of this sort of dizzying achievements of techno-scientific modernity, and that seemingly demonstrates the boundless plasticity of human bodies and their potential. Or in Freud's hands, we appear as this sort of degraded figure who is nevertheless this critical allegory for the unconscious that clarifies his theory of same-sex desire as inversion. My computer is mucking up. That clarifies his critical allegory, that clarifies his theory of same-sex desire as inversion and castration anxiety. So here, willful feminization stands as this looming threat of egoic injury, clarifying the operation and universality of cis sex. So we can see echoes and wary repetitions of these sort of framings in our own times, with transgender as a synecdoche for gender trouble writ large, from far-right fantasists dreaming of a surging wave of effeminacy sweeping all in its wake, to the condescending patronage of well-meaning do-gooders, predatory psychiatrists demonizing transgender desires with taxonomies that they would never accept applied to themselves, to sensationalist publishers looking for a quick cash grab with lurid tales of gender deviance, indecency, and criminality. phobic Lacanian psychoanalysis, casting transition as literally a psychotic desire, to the tenured yet tedious queer theory scrambling to offer a novel articulation of stale and familiar territory. Trans people are frequently ushered onto the stage of theory for grander purposes of themselves, only to be quickly dismissed in turn, purpose served, premises intact. So this is kind of a dispiriting state of affairs, something we wanted to attempt to sort of thoroughgoing break with as we approached the book and its compilation. So a more like an expansive account of trans life as it is lived from the inside, and not merely as a supplement to somebody else's theoretical story. And I think there's a real felt need by many trans people for writing that encounters these entrenched ideas, for understanding our experiences, that speaks to them and their conditions, that is written by them and expresses what they know to be intimately true, yet frequently discounted. And for many trans people, that quite naturally means writing in a Marxist register. So when it comes to transgender theorizing and writing, there is often very little new under the sun, but there is never a shortage of people claiming the opposite to be the case. So we're not here to plant our flag and say that there's any sort of radical novelty here. Rather, we stand in this long lineage and proud tradition of gender radical subversives who paved the way before us, who've written lots and lots of brilliant insights that are often discarded and left to collect for dust on the shelves. So Marx has been read by people of all social positions in the past 200 years, and this is no less true of transgender people themselves. So when assembling the collection, we were keen to express the point that we don't really think there is one authoritative approach to Marx, and nor did we seek to impose one. Marxism is this broad and living tradition, or defined by its continual internal disputations, its fighting schools, its contested orthodoxies. And this is reflected in the collection itself. Different chapters find their inspiration in a different facet of Marx's practice. So Marx, the proto-sociologist, huddled over his empirical research in the British Library, Marx the philosopher, Marx the propagandist and organisation genius who spent a lot of time organising the First International and so forth. The collection reflects this diverse heterogeneity of approaches, traditions and problematics, the broad appeal of different moments of Marx's work to a variety of different audiences, from investigations in cosmic value form rationalism and gender as a real abstraction, to gay communist Lacanian psychoanalysis, the imminent critique of psychological research, to the continent of Marx and disability studies, Brazilian transfeminism, Black transfeminism, sociological workers' inquiry, Marxian Deleuzian analysis, and Marxist epistemological inquiry, each a different angle on transgender life, each a different angle on Marx's work, and each a different approach to a thoroughgoing transgender Marxism. And that's what the book is about, basically.
No, thank you. That's like, it's no mean feat to kind of have to give a whistle-stop tour of like, you know, such a kind of expansive, and also because, yeah, every essay in the book is, for people who haven't bought it already yet, it's obviously each essay is so different. And one of the things that I like, which obviously, yeah, you both mentioned in your introduction, which you kind of alluded to there, when you say about there's no kind of, there's no radical novelty, was how you expressed it, was I really liked, and I think, yeah, it's what I alluded to at the start, was that, yeah, aiming for a mass marketed book is in itself kind of still, unfortunately, kind of a bit of a novelty, in the sense that a lot of this knowledge is often contained in kind of like ephemeral online spaces, perhaps on social media posts, these places that, yeah, like somewhat less traditional. And I thought it'd be a good point to bring Nat in, because I know that like the transfeminism zine, which I've read a lot. Like, I think it's like a really interesting example of that. But I know I'd be interested to hear more about your essay, Nat, because it's obviously on queer Marxist transfeminism and social reproduction. I don't know if you would feel more comfortable kind of explaining to the audience what your contribution looked like, and then from there, if you're happy to sort of talk about the work that you do around that as well, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm here with my cat Angela. She's a good company. It's also really nice to be at Housmans, especially with all these memories, because actually, like, my kind of like intellectual adventure in Marxist feminism kind of begins at Housmans, where I was like, I remember this like really important conversation I had with one of the people who become one of my PhD supervisors, Samuel Solomon. He's a great Marxist feminist. Like, we like went to Housmans and like the beginning of my like exploration in Marxist feminism. And here we are, like 8 years later. And yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the genesis of my chapter, just because I think it's helpful to situate that and maybe to read some of that, and we can talk about other stuff. But that's what I'm kind of feeling now. So it's like, I guess like, so I started this like PhD on queer Marxism. I'm going to drop it in the chat also because it's open access. Boom. Panelists, attendees, so you can read it. My essay in the book, which is on queer and trans social reproduction, is part of that work. The version of the book is revised. And what do I want to say? I guess at the time I was really interested, I like began this project being like, okay, so what is the relationship between Marxism and queer theory, and like how I kind of was in this like, I wanted queer theory to go deeper into a theoretical engagement with Marxism, and I was going to write that myself if I had to, and spent a lot of time reading a large chunk of Capital and a lot of Marx, and like also trying to figure out what was happening in queer theory around that. So a lot of my thinking around transliberalism kind of emerged from that as well, and trying to reflect that back into like how things were playing out around trans rights in this kind of like 2010 to 2015 period. And I'm not going to, I don't want to get, we can talk about that later. Because I also feel like what's happening now is as in by now, we mean like since 2017, as Jules described, is actually just like a more extreme kind of like, obviously everything politically has shifted even further to the right, but this stuff was happening for a long time already. So anyway, so what do I want to say? So I was also involved in a series of intellectual interventions, which is my role as like the queer, trans, Marxist, a literary person who does archive work. I'm always like pulling whatever my other discipline is into a space. But yeah, I made a series of interventions into the Historical Materialism London Conference in 2014 and 2015. In 2014, I presented the work that partly became partly turned into the transliberalism work. In 2015, I presented the initial version of this chapter as an intervention into the revival of social reproduction theory. I was really frustrated by the lack of queer and trans analysis in that social reproduction theory. And the people who were doing this work as well alongside me obviously were like Holly Lewis, Alan Sears, were doing really great work. If it wasn't for them, they were in the front row of the panel. I was really frustrated also because the response from the wider social reproduction theory was to continually reproduce this marginalization of queer and transness. So we had like a panel on Sunday morning of the Historical Materialism London Conference, which is like the final day. It's like me, Cassandra Troyan, and Maya Gonzalez, and I can't remember who the other panelist was, somebody really good. We weren't even in the stream. I think that was like, I'd written this intervention into the Marxist feminist stream, and we weren't even there. And from that, the sexuality, political economy stream kind of has spun from these interventions, from my work, from Holly Lewis's work and Alan Sears' work. So I really wanted to put that out there, because that's like where the beginning was. And it was like, I was really interested in how returning to archives was providing theoretical information that we could use now, and how it would help us to understand what's happening now. At the same time, my everyday life was marked by being in very serious, caring relations with my friends, with my partner, with other people in my life, particularly other queer and trans people of color, but not exclusively. And we were like hanging on by our pants, like, we were hanging on by for dear life amidst like what was happening around with like austerity, and how our lives were being destroyed by austerity and being made impossible. And so I really wanted to like valorize that in terms of the political work we were doing and why that was important. And it was this whole thing kind of begun from doing some research on STAR, on Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. At the time in 2015, Tourmaline's interventions of like, which are this like taking the archive out of the New York Public Library and putting it on Tumblr, were just kind of gaining speed. This like revival of STAR was taking place, but I was also really frustrated with how it was deracializing. Well, I mean, there are other people who've written about it as well, how it misses the context that STAR were actually working on. working from, which is not just about gay liberation, but is really also about Black and brown, like Black and third world liberation in the American context. And I have like so much more to say. I have an unpublished essay from this time that's about this, that I hopefully one day will see the light of day. And so that was all of the like, okay, so how did these archives in the book, in the chapter in the book, as to talk about wages due lesbians, who were this, specifically the like UK arm of this, they were a subsection of the International Wages for Housework movement. And they produced this like incredible pamphlet that was published in the early 90s, literally just like, it's got an incredible critique of Section 28 of the Local Government Act, which banned conversation about promotion of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship in schools, which I say because I know there are people out there who, like in their 30s who don't know about Section 28, which is a lot for those of us who are educated under it, right? So they produced this amazing analysis tying that to an economic critique of Thatcherism. And they also produced this like huge like list of the kinds of emotional labor that they had to do in order to like support their friends and family and like keep people in the country and stuff. And this is all like, I was like, where is this in the canon of Marxist feminism? Specifically wages due lesbians as well, who are so explicitly part of the wages for housework movement. And we're involved in we're producing their work out of Crossroads Women's Centre in North London. And yeah, so there's so much in that and so much that felt important, and like also to then problematize this question about like what social reproduction looks like and how a queer and trans perspective, particularly a queer and trans of color perspective, troubles how we think about social reproduction. So on the one hand, it's like our lives are just like, you know, the nuclear family is like racist and homophobic and transphobic, right, often. And I mean that as an institution. And that makes our lives impossible. And then we have to like cobble together what other resources and other, you know, the whole idea of chosen family, like in order to find ways to survive, find ways to support each other and care for each other. And I think from a trans perspective, that's like, it goes really deep. I think that we as trans people are collective productions. Like, we don't exist in isolation. We can't exist in isolation. And the individualization of how a trans life has been reproduced is like a symptom of like the medicalization and psychiatrization of transsexuality. And yeah, so it's a lot. And I also just wanted to pull together so much thought, because it was like, whilst I was frustrated with the heteronormativity and cisnormativity of the like the revival of social reproduction theory. This is again like 5 or 6 years ago. Jules has done really important work since then as well, intervening into this. And there was other work that was happening that felt important. So like Joni Cohen, Sophie Munk's essay on queerness as precarity does a lot of really important theoretical work. There's some great work in femme theory, like in femme subculture, that was also thinking through this. Which I might even read just this quote from Leah Lakshmi Papanizer Samarasintha, because it's like, it said so much to me. So she writes, she's talking about how poor, of color, sick, disabled parenting, sex worker and or rural femmes hold it the fuck down, is her quote. This is on page 90 in the book. So she writes like, your life as a working class or poor and or sex working and or disabled and or black or brown femme person has taught you that the only damn way you or anybody survives is by helping each other. No institutions exist to help us survive. We survive because of each other. Your life is maintained by a complex, non-monetary economy of shared reciprocal care. And they continue. We organize miracles, from complex political actions to the life support work of making sure people are fed, don't die, don't get evicted, and no sleep and low spoons, no quarter tank of gas. Our organizing skills in these departments are incredible and often not respected as much as masculine leaders, or indeed seen as skills. Far too often, the emotional labor we do isn't seen as labor, it's seen as air, that little thing you do on the side. So there's something also in that about how the gendered and racialized division of labor under capitalism like is functioning culturally, and This kind of comes up a little bit in Rosemary Hennessy's work. But it's like, I think it's this important thing of like, on the one hand, the forms of caring labor and socially reproductive labor we do are devalued, especially because of this racialized and gendered character of that work. And then simultaneously, like, the forms that we have to do as trans and queer people are like illegible from this heteronormative context, which I think is again like this, how that, say, the social reproduction stream at historical materialism wouldn't recognize that labor, for instance. So I don't know how long I've been talking, but that's maybe helpful. I could probably read a little bit of my essay. Should I do that?
Yeah, read a bit. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, please.
I'm just going to read. Oh yeah, so there's another whole section I was going to talk about a little bit, which is about how. So I write a little bit about how Black feminist thought and Black feminist writing also like changes how we think about social reproduction, in the sense of like it formulates a lot of this work as a form of resistance, because the nature of like Black and brown lives, or Black lives in particular, surviving under racial capitalism is like radical kind of in itself. But then simultaneously that it becomes this work that's, if the orientation of the socially reproductive labor we're doing is oriented towards each other and towards ourselves, that becomes a way of like potentially short-circuiting like how our lives are expropriated by capital for profit. But anyway, okay, so I'm just going to read from the conclusion to the essay. So it's not the most excitingly written bit, but it's 105 if you're following from home. To formulate a queer and trans social reproduction requires expanding the concept of social reproduction to make legible the caring labor that enables and maintains queer and trans people and lives. The loving and sexual pleasure, the cooking and feeding and housing, resting and rearing, cleaning and washing and dressing, the emotional and psychological support, transition advice and specialized counseling, healthcare support, the work of creating our genders, performances or expressions, the very fabrication of us. Reconceiving socially reproductive labor from the trans and queer perspective allows us to consider such labor both as work of resistance that enables our being and as unpaid labor, work that is valuable and necessary. So these are the two kind of examples, like enables our being is like Star, and also what like other queer and trans writers, kind of subcultural writers are talking about. And unpaid labor is very much what Wages Lesbians are interested in addressing. So this is a struggle that is always challenging and sometimes pleasurable. So we must recognize and affirm the necessary work for our survival within racial capitalist society as work. Work is required to flourish when our lives are marked for destruction within racial capitalist nation states, from imprisonment to maiming to deportation. Our labor, love and caring, and the forms of community, sociality and worlds that are produced, breaking out of and pushing against the expectations of race, gender, ability, labor and desire, are each important forms of work. There is merit that exists to each of these facets of queer life, despite their minimal exchange value, if they have any. Such work must be situated within the political economy of the racial and gender division of labor under capitalism. The labor of feminized, racialized, queer, trans, disabled and or migrant workers is materialized and socially devalued. A division of labor under which we are often poor, often overworked or underpaid or underemployed or unemployed. The devaluation of our works and lives is a historically specific phenomenon. It relates to the world of racial capitalism we inhabit. In its rapid drive for commodification, such caring labor is subsumed as a form of low-waged work. The reproduction of queer lives and worlds often takes place within communal and subcultural spaces or queer households. In queer households is Joni Cohen, Sophie Muck's formulation. These socially reproductive centers have often remained marginal, emerging outside of the confines of the homophobic, racist nuclear family. They exist apart from and against the racialized and gendered division of labor that is reproduced by private households. This is not to say that queer and trans bodies, lives, and monogamous familial forms are not dependent on domestic spaces. As Wages Lesbians argued, the familial forms we have been inhabiting and creating for decades are often rendered invisible as sites of social reproduction. Often queer households have existed in unrecognized or clandestine forms, actively delegitimized by the state. Even the limited state recognition of monogamous LGBT family forms today occurs alongside a material divestment in social security and welfare. This process further rests the costs of social reproduction on private relationships. The state has begun to recognize homosexual households only as the meeting of social needs has become more thoroughly privatized than ever before. And that's in relation to austerity. Okay, so I'm just gonna read this last bit. So how might queer and trans social reproduction inform political strategies? This question seems especially pressing in the contemporary context of the International Women's Strike on 8th March, including forms of queer and trans feminist gender strikes and sex workers strikes. It should be clear that such articulations emerge from positions of being surplus, if not precarious, in respect to capital's demands for labor power and the state's valuations of lives. Surplus life is responded to by the state through cutting welfare as much as through police surveillance and incarceration. The disproportionate demands of social reproductive labor on queer and trans, or feminized, disabled and or people of color results in the impoverishment of our communities. How might we be able to maintain and build our resources, including our valuable skills in organizing caring labor, to ensure we work for ourselves? How can we resist the appropriation of our efforts by capital? It just kind of continues, but yeah. So maybe I'll pause there. And yeah.
No, thank you for that. Now that was so, yeah, so in depth and so interesting. And I'm wondering whether or not, I mean, we don't have any questions. I'm going to urge people to ask questions because otherwise I'm going to have to do it. Because so far we've got one question, which is Transgender Marxism is the book for an emerging glamorous femme cult, yes or no, which is the answer is yes. So it's been answered. Thanks for that question. What I think, whilst we're kind of waiting to see if we have, while I wait for some questions to appear, what I was interested to put to kind of the panel in general, for anyone to answer this, so kind of on a very sort of very simplistic basis perhaps, but I mean, all of us have probably written or published or worked or organized in leftist spaces, and I think probably all of us have, I mean, I think there was even some probably around this event, is when you try and sort of talk about trans issues as a leftist issue, there are cisgender leftists who refuse to believe that that this is compatible, that there isn't, that the trans politics are a leftist cause or a core leftist cause. And I know that's been the case before with gay liberation politics. I'm wondering if there was anyone that you thought was in the audience who is a bit skeptical, what you think you would say to them, and what you think in the book, what your position is on that. I mean, I have read it, so I know that you do sort of address it quite early on, but I'm just intrigued to know, and about how, your own experiences on the left, about the skepticism that can sometimes come on the left, as you've mentioned that we're kind of overrepresented on the left, but often there is this kind of institutional hostility. Sorry, I don't know if that's a clear enough question, but I'd be intrigued to know, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience would be intrigued to know your thoughts. I'm gonna go with Jules.
Yeah, I think like you say, this is something which has happened before. Previously, it occurred with the second wave of feminism and gay liberation. Like, there's always been dismissive voices. I highly recommend this collection by Pat Mitchell, which is entitled Pink Triangles, which pulls together, I think it's a collection from the 1980s, which pulls together the previous decades kind of like essays on this topic, including one collective of cisgender communist lesbians who sort of actually critique another sort of anti-imperialist group that's put out one of these homophobic statements. So this is a familiar thing, which any whatever your position, like when you try and bring these things forward and talk about your own social conditions, there are people who will say that this is not relevant, not electorally viable, not materialist. I mean, the exact grounds for dismissal are going to change from context to context, but the short answer is there are many people who just kind of don't want these things to be talked about, or increasingly who have their own what's bringing about transgender people. So kind of like the corporate plot, big pharma model of transgender life. So there's like a huge range of dismissive and hostile attitudes, which increasingly I think I'm just sort of not bothered with. And it's exactly for that reason you've talked about. It's that we know that a disproportionate number of transgender people are sort of drawn into these radical groups, into these revolutionary circles. And that's something which I think people are going to have to get used to on one level, like, because there's sort of no, like this Pat Mitchell collection, I mentioned this essay in it. I'm not saying that that kind of an enterprise, I'm not saying that like responding point to a homophobe or to a transphobe or something is not useful, and it's never been useful. I think these are very kind of interesting bits of work, but I think like ultimately it's useful, but there's also this kind of exhaustion which sets in with it. And actually this was one of the things which I found most with this radical trans feminism thing, which Nat and a comrade of ours edited. I think that was kind of the downplaying of this kind of conflict with transphobic feminists or TERFs or whatever you call them, was one of the things which I found kind of most struck a chord with me. But anyway, I would be interested to hear what the others think.
Does anyone else have any thoughts? Yeah, I'm just checking.
So if materialist conceptions of history versus gender identity and stuff like that, I mean, I think that's like an issue that we deal with, I think, quite effectively in the introduction. I mean, we do mobilize the queer feminist thought of Angela Metropolis. I mean, lots of what I write is generally often footnotes to Metropolis, who is like a very underread and undercited thinker who's been very influential on me. So she has this theory of oikonomia, so the nexus of race, gender, class, and sexuality and nation constituted through the premise of the properly productive household. So material economies already implicate sexual economies, because theories of sexual reproduction and intergenerational inheritance are also theories of property ownership, wealth, and entitlement. So when it comes to gender and race sexuality, under this lens, we can see that they are not these sort of analyses that can be pulled apart one from the other and perhaps reassembled. They are just different means of talking about the same social object, alternative perspectives on the same question, which is property, exploitation, and social order, and their illegitimate or legitimate reproduction and conveyance from one generation to the next. So when we talk about, like, say, TERFs or ethno-nationalist politics or the Republican right, what are they doing? Why they are so obsessed with trans women as such? Why they are so obsessed with this idea of critical race theory, which is the new buzzword at the moment, which has gotten a lot of heat in the past few months, because ethno-nationalist politics of like far-right groups are always simultaneously patriarchal, racial, and familial, making claims about what a good and orderly world looks like, demarcating who is entitled to what and what is expected of them in return, and endeavoring to bring that about. So you are, there are men and there are women, and there you shall remain, is basically the impetus of what the backlash against trans people is. It's forcing you to go into a certain place. It's setting the bounds of thresholds of exploitation. And, you know, when it becomes a sort of these impositions of gender expectations and racial discrimination are also claims about where the acceptable threshold of exploitation ought to lie and on what terms. So whether your labor is waged or unwaged, whether it is compensated well or poorly, even the type of work you do or do not is contingent on your ability to embody this sort of socially plausible femininity or masculinity within the background of racial discrimination. So you cannot talk about class, you know, without talking about gender, sex, race in a sort of comprehensive way. It is not an alternative. It is how class is understood, it is lived, and how it is imposed. So talking about trans issues is just a way to give a more thoroughgoing account of class itself, rather than marginalization of it from the issue at all.
Thank you for that, Nat.
Yeah, I think I could just add to what Elle just said, which is, I think it's often about like, so I'm like, which leftists? Who are the leftists who can't deal with trans? And this dynamic of like marginalized people in a wider class struggle being sided is like a historical dynamic that plays out over and over again. And I mean that in a kind of like particular context. I'm thinking a lot about how you know, like Aimé Césaire's like response, a letter on like why he was quitting the Communist Party in the late 40s is like the same thing. And it's like, Césaire's like, oh yeah, I'm interested in, not in just, you know, reproducing universalism, but like a universalism that's rooted on the deepening of all particulars. And there's also quite a famous moment in like 1970, so my dates are a bit rusty, where Huey P. Newton comes out in support of gay liberation, and he's responding to like the homophobia of the in the Black Power movement. And then simultaneously, there's also this great moment, also in 1970, where the women of in third world liberation, particularly in Puerto Rican liberation, are like, hey, we can't, like, all of this argument that feminism's this white women's movement misses the fact that women are, you know, experiencing double or triple oppression within these movements, within racial capitalism. And so there's always this dynamic of like somebody being in the position of particularity will be marginalized by people who are in the position of the majority. And when I'm like, which leftists, I'm literally like, you know, who am I interested in building a revolutionary movement with? For me personally, you know, I don't work with that many white men. There are a few out there, especially the Edinburgh anarchists. Shout out to them. But like, it's like I'm interested in building like coalitional struggles with other marginalized people, and like, if you know, sometimes it's that case of like the people who want to be dominant in the left and not the people who are going to create the space to be building a coalitional struggle across difference. So that's I mean, it's not necessarily, it might be quite defeatist and it might sound kind of separatist, but that's like the reality of how I think the organizing happens. So that's not to say like transphobia isn't a problem or transmisogyny isn't a problem in these other spaces and in the other forms of struggle, but it's about like how we approach those things with a certain kind of generosity or a certain kind of resilience. And like, shout out to my collaborator, Maker Van der Drift, who helped co-edit the zine and who I'm working on a project with at the moment. Because their work's been really important in like helping me think through some of this stuff too. So yeah.
No, thank you for that. And I was going to say, I think it's really interesting on a personal note. You obviously mentioned Huey Newton, but also earlier when you were talking about Star, because we're obviously in the middle of, it's now Pride Month. I don't know when it became a whole month, but but obviously what we see in now this kind of commodified Pride Month is this kind of flattening of early gay liberation history. And I think it's really interesting that you kind of mentioned that about Star and about the kind of coalitional politics, because it's much more interesting, I think, in a richer history than who was at Stonewall and, you know, this kind of. And so I definitely think it sounds like a really interesting part.
And like, I'm really interested in this intellectual history of like how these historicizations have been made. So on the one hand, like the memory of stars literally only revived in the 90s, and between 1973 and 1994, like nobody gives a fuck, you know? Like, and I know, Shon, like we both have like unwritten books on gay liberation, and like things in common, it's good. But I do think my unwritten book on gay liberation would be making the argument that basically from like 1971 onwards, it's the same white guy liberals who try and co-opt a movement and really offset this kind of radical impulse, which I think only maybe existed only between 1965 and 1971. And like, Abraham Lewis has some really great work on this, also writing about the intersections between trans, like mental patients / consumer survivor movements and disability justice movements. So yeah, so people should definitely check out their works, writing in the North American context. But it's like, yeah, I think there's just like, there are so many of these dynamics that have been playing out, and like we're in this moment of like, which is why I think why I would always make an argument for historical materialism, which is like, history is really there for us to reinterpret it and put it back out there. And the work that's excited me the most in terms of like trans people doing radical theory, doing radical work, either be that like archiving work, be that like art, be that like you know, like more formally Marxist work that is under a banner of Marxism, is doing some of that and is like, because we have the whole world to like reinterpret, right? So it's like,
yeah, you should write your unwritten book. I won't be writing mine, but you should definitely. I think it would be good. We do have some audience questions, which I am like delighted about. So hopefully, yeah, we have enough for actually, because we have to be quite tight to time. I encouraged them all. We spoke, and now, as ever, people have asked their questions. But you can, if they're quick as well, we can take more. But I'll just do them in the order that they arrived in. So I think it was Elle who mentioned the imminent critique of psychological research, which is mentioned in the book. I'm curious to hear more about this, if possible, as a psychological researcher developing trauma-informed psychological interventions for trans and gender diverse individuals.
Okay, so I'm not a psychologist. I will not speak too broadly and stay within my own understandings. But the chapter is Noah Zazanis, Social Reproduction and Social Cognition, Gender Identity Development in a Community Context. And it is sort of taking on a sort of unpopular understanding of gendered socialization. It kind of gets a reductive form in Catherine McKinnon, but then it takes a kind of life on its own on in the past few years, particularly online and particularly with transphobic feminist spaces, where the idea is that there is a certain sort of socialization that is kind of, it's like a conveyor belt of like being a man. So you were raised as a man and you get all this like conveyor belt of ideas about socialization, and it gets fed into you, your brain, and you just reflect that. And so you go about walking through the world with male privilege and male understandings of the world and blah, blah, blah. And thus it's kind of like, it's very reductive, and it's also in a sense not particularly social in any identifiable way, because there's nothing you can do or no sort of social relationship you can obtain, which kind of changes you from the sort of upbringing that you had. So it's kind of a weird but quite popular understanding in transphobic feminist circles. And Noah Zazanis takes this on with aplomb and goes through the sort of psychological research, and also critiques Littman, who came up with the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, and goes through that. But it's also focusing on the idea that socialization is a dialectical and social process where we have many sort of sources of understanding and gendered understanding and ideas and imprints, and we can pick and choose how we relate to the world. Even people who live in similar circumstances come out remarkably differently. And that's kind of a really valuable and important perspective and like confrontation with this sort of like quite popular transphobic idea. I think Jules has been discussing socialization a lot recently. If you have anything to add to that, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this socialization, it's yeah, the thing with socialization is I think that it's usually spoken about quite loosely, sort of in movement circles, rather than like argued out quite thoroughly. Because of course this is even within psychoanalysis, this is an enormous and long-standing debate that's gone on from some of the earliest generations of psychoanalytic thinking. So I'm thinking here about the schism between Jacques Lacan, his acolytes, and Melanie Klein, who has more of this eruptive view that like children, even from the age of being a toddler, are more like an active participant or like an irritant in the family structure. So there's like childhood agency, which appears a lot sooner and needs to be taken into consideration according to Melanie Klein. But yeah, so in this book, I suppose there are really two chapters which are addressing this head on. One is Noah Zazanis's chapter, which I was just talking about, and the second is Zandra Metcalf. And Zandra's essay is definitely kind of more of a sort of Freudian speculative kind of thing. Originally, the plan was that Noah's essay was going to be the first essay and Zandra's was going to be the last essay. That didn't actually end up happening, but I think in my head that's still the kind of symmetry. And they're both sort of tackling the same question, which is this big puzzle of why do people end up cisgender? Like, why would someone be assigned their sex and then stick with it rather than abandoning it during their development? Which is a big curiosity. And I think they have like different answers, but that's sort of both what their chapters are trying to do. And I think they provide some very interesting insights to it. Something which very few people would know, I suspect, unless you're in these strange circles, is there is increasingly like among sort of, I guess what you'd call like psychoanalysis, as in people reading L'Écrit and reading like esoteric French texts to try and understand global issues and global mechanisms in people's things. There's been a lot of trans people who are very interested in this and very interested in kind of navigating the rather fraught stuff around it. This isn't really what I prefer to do, but I am familiar with a lot of people who have taken a very powerful interest in this kind of stuff. There's actually a practicing psychoanalyst who contributed to the book, although her chapter has nothing to do with that topic. So this is something which maybe if people are interested in this kind of thing, there's all kinds of like online communities and email lists and unlikely Facebook groups and stuff which you can get into. But a lot of the time, I would say it's also a lot of it's heavily informed by Alain Badiou, as well as Lacan, Zizek, and all the other usual suspects. So yeah, there's kind of a lot going on there. But I would say those two chapters in the book are probably two very different approaches to that same question.
Thank you for that. Nat, did you have anything to say on that one? No, cool. We'll go on to this question. Given that we're dealing with a global anti-trans movement, which is particularly threatening to our liberation here in the UK, how do panelists think trans communities can use transgender Marxism practically to organize for our collective struggle? What will it take for the ubiquitous trans communist cat girls to get organized? Does anyone want to lead on that? Like, if I paraphrase about the kind of, I think the question is getting at the idea of the link between theory feeding back into, I guess, praxis, think it's feeding back into activism, and about kind of, yeah, what your perspectives are on that, about the relationship between the two, and particularly, I guess, given that there is perhaps a lack of an organized activist movement with radical roots in the UK and beyond.
Yeah, I'm going to go first. For me, I guess that, again, the link between theory and praxis in terms of like theory and practice, or praxis in terms of what I've been talking about, is also the like, you have to build your own liberation and you can't wait for the state to hand it over on a plate. And I think the forms of like collective care and also mutual aid, especially, like, obviously has become like a almost depoliticized buzzword during the pandemic, but that these forms of solidarity and support are actually really important and do really important forms of work that make life more possible for us. And that, like, I think like through focusing on that, there's a lot of reason to have hope. And I would definitely spend more of my time giving a shit about that than reading the newspapers, right? Like, I'm not saying that I don't want to downplay the like violence of the state, because you can't really downplay it, especially now. Like, the pandemic has been an excuse, another reason for the Tories to ramp up the forms of social violence they enact, particularly on Black and brown and disabled people. And there's been a load of, I mean, it's just like there's been one smokescreen after the other in terms of the pandemic isn't obviously just a smokescreen, but Brexit was also a smokescreen in the sense of like the Tories being able to get away with enacting more divestment and direct forms of violence as well. And you know, there are like 100 examples of that. But all of these things are always about trans liberation. Yeah, I probably have more to say, but I could pause there. And I think that like that we're talking about Marxism as a practice, right? It's not just like, I think it's been really, I like my whole relationship for Marxism is definitely in this post-financial crisis moment of like everyone went back to read Marx, including me as an adult, and there's been loads of really great work that we were always doing in practice, because at the time we were part of an anti-austerity movement that was fighting against closures to HIV/AIDS services. And so it was very clear, like, here is what the state's doing, here's the forms of support the state is providing, which, I mean, in terms of like, at the time the state was bailing out banks. Now we have the state like funding all of these, like, you know, funding, like making all these deals over WhatsApp with the people who are providing the services that we're supposedly using during the pandemic, provided they're actually existing services. you know, as in like some of them don't even exist as a service. So like, yeah, this is all part of like, how do we fight for the things that we do need from the that we might need from the state, and how do we also build alternatives? Because I don't think we can just sit around waiting for the state to fund trans healthcare, and, you know, even doing GRA reform is like, how much of a material difference really is GRA reform going to make? And I know that's a difficult question for us to ask ourselves, but we should be asking that question. And it's going to make some material difference, but it might be smaller than other things that we could be doing.
Yeah, I think that's true, Nat. I mean, I think one of the big lacuna of sort of like online trans feminist discourse and like trans activism at the moment is generally it seems to fight battles on the terrain that's been selected for it. So we end up putting lots of energy into GRA reform, which is probably not worth the effort in the end. We end up putting stuff into responding to newspaper articles or the latest attack and like from some columnist that we don't really care about, who was always a has-been and nobody's read for years. I mean, it's like, it's a lot of effort, and it often is applied to the wrong sort of sources. And we do have, like for my own part, I have been involved on hiatus at the moment because of my health, but I have been involved in a trans feminist organization called Queer Care, where we do sort of like advocacy and training and also protest support as well. And that has been like immensely rewarding in like keeping yourself away from the sort of like back and forth that never seems to go anywhere. And I think like if you end up focusing on sort of like the online sphere, you end up like having a certain myopia or like a narrow view of how things are changing or how they will change or how we can change or bring about social change ourselves. And I think that's really important to like take a step back and to get up, to go to new avenues and perhaps like work in community with other people rather than sort of responding. I mean, I've been to trans feminist protests, and I mean, like, bless their hearts, a lot of the speeches were about stuff online, and I found it really absurd. I just found it really absurd. Like, I was like, okay, you're talking about Glinner at a protest. It just felt so surreal.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah.
I don't even know what that is. Like, you know.
That's a great response. Thanks, Elle. Is there anything else you wanted to add? I just realised that I had cut across you.
No, it's fine.
I just thought, I don't know if Jules had anything to say. What I was just thinking about what you were saying too is, and what both of you had said too, and it ties into the original question, is also alongside this kind of, if you like, obsession with the media and representation and like some of these liberal demands that you said, GRA reform, is also the kind of rise of the trans ally, which is also a very online Twitter thing of like maybe using a hashtag, cis ally, which is a kind of feel good. I mean, it's kind of a good circle jerk for a lot of people, if we're being honest. And I think that's very different from what we're talking here about coalition and the idea of working with people who are maybe not trans, but are engaged with this stuff. Because I don't know how many self-identified trans allies really know about perhaps the healthcare struggle, and that's not always their fault. But obviously, it's the terms on which it's been set as being this kind of polarized, often online debate. Jules, I don't know if there's anything else you had to add.
Yeah, I guess I would just like to affirm what you're saying. Yeah, these allies are very often like, often they're focused on this slogan about trans rights. And there was this fundraiser for mermaids, I suppose, that one of these YouTubers was doing. And for those of you who don't know the organization, Mermaids is like, unlike Gendered Intelligence, like one of these organizations which only works with, it's an organization that only works with trans children with supportive parents.
And also it grew out of a support group for people at Tavistock in London. It's a parent support group, and it grew out of that, and it's not actually a trans-led charity at all, and it gets all the money.
And I feel like it's not a bad thing to do a fundraiser for a group like that. It's just that there are other organizations like Gendered Intelligence which actually service all trans youth, you know what I mean? And it's exactly what Elle was saying, this kind of responsive, this putting out fires model, which, I think allies are especially prone to. And again, it's not that I don't appreciate the sentiment and the effort, and it's not like I think it's a bad thing for mermaids to receive support when it's being attacked by transphobes, but like maybe we can focus on something a bit more like, something which works for the majority of trans youth, for instance. So yeah, but with regards to like organizing the cat girls, I think basically everyone in this contribution, everyone who would put together like a chapter on transgender Marxism, and knowing them personally, all of them have done all kinds of different stuff, like all sorts of different small or national scale organizing. I'm not going to give you like a whole rundown, but like the thing is like most of these essays are not really focused on that. Most of these essays are not sort of a personal account of like my own political activity. I'd say the closest we've got there is like Farah Thompson's piece, The Bridge Between Gender and Organizing, is sort of like dealing with that in one aspect, and J.N. Hode's piece. So these are the more kind of like, kind of the more confessional, the more sort of like directly autobiography informed pieces in the collection. And for that reason, they're sort of focused on the stuff that these writers were doing. In J.N. Hode's case, there's this sort of stuff about Kinky Boots, which is like a queer night in Lancaster, which I think is very sort of lucidly and excitingly described. So like you can like see bits and pieces of activism in this book, but also I think the point is like the point is like we have to be realistic that like a lot of the time activism isn't one thing which trans people are compelled towards and like drawn into, and like I would say pretty heavily overly represented in, especially when it comes to like revolutionary organizing, like explicitly revolutionary organizing. That's clearly the case. But also there's this kind of like sustainability question. It's like in reality, most trans people who are involved in organizing are not going to continue doing this like year in, year out for the rest of their lives. And I think that's just something we kind of have to accept and think of as like, fine, you know what I mean? Like activism is never going to be all of politics. Like there's always going to be stuff besides that and other things, other ways you can like assist struggles without sort of like saying, okay, well, I'm going to show up to this meeting and we're going to be sitting here for 2 hours and talking about exactly what acronym to use on our flyers and stuff like that. Like this is always going to be something which is like a minority. If like a disproportionately large minority for trans people. Anyway,
I'm gonna jump in and say just on the back of what Jules is describing as well. Like, I think there's something important to remember, that it's like activism doesn't have to take place in an organization. I'm thinking about this line from Verity Spot, who's a poet based in Brighton, and they write like, "I don't want allies, I want accomplices." And my advice is like, if you had to give any advice to some budding activists or some people who want to get their allies to do something more solidariness, is that what I want to say? Than just posting on Twitter, which is like, you know, you and your friend can start doing something. You know, even small interventions can make a big difference, even if you're literally just like making some small interventions into your local space, like. That you don't need to wait for a group, just like start small, start local, and start doing something. Or, you know, and if there's something that's clearly like evident in terms of a need that you and your friend or the other people around you are in need of, then like start working from there and figure out how you can solve it yourselves. And it's like, I guess I'm like, is that like sometimes these like anarcho-syndicalist methodologies of doing stuff are actually more useful than starting a big organization and calling a meeting and then all the things that go through that. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but like, yeah, sometimes there are more efficient ways to do things, easier ways to do things. Yeah.
Let me unmute myself. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left to bring us up to the neat 90 minutes panel vibe. And we have one more question, and it's a very good kind of classic conclusion for this sort of thing. Is someone's just asked, and I'd probably put this if we have time to everyone on the panel, is what do you personally hope to see in the next 5 years in UK politics, both in terms of trans rights, but also wider societal change? Does anyone want to start on that? I know it's not like it's a big one. Elle?
Well, apart from like full communism.
Yeah, exactly. Full communism now.
I mean, I think at the moment it's very heated. The trans discussion, like it's very heated. It's very intense. It feels overwhelming. And often, you know, you end up seeing lots of stuff in the media and reading it every day. But I would like to say, like, if you took the UK in about 1988, when Section 28 had just been introduced, and the Catholic Church was just hideously homophobic towards gay people, and the AIDS crisis was, you know, in full blow. And if you said, you know, in 20 years' time, who will define the narrative of sex and gender? Who will define, you know, how we live and how we interact and how we love each other? Will it be gay rights activists, or will it be the Conservative Party and the Catholic Church? You probably would have said the Conservative Party and the Catholic Church, and you would have been completely wrong. And I think a similar thing now in terms of trans liberation and changing cultural attitudes, and the sort of work that is not seen in the papers and is not seen in the op-eds, is all this sort of like underground sort of communication and talking to people and activism that is not widely appreciated, but is going on nevertheless. And I think you will see similar changes in how we understand trans people and transgender issues and trans politics. There will be a wider acceptance, and lots of people just don't know it yet.
That was really hopeful. That actually picked me up, Elle. Do Jules or Nat, do either of you have any thoughts on that? Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. And actually, that's part of it. I think like there's something about how a culture will functions, and like the forms of narratives that take the people who get the space in dominant spaces aren't always the people who are doing the narrative, and you know, it's even like, sorry, who are making the narrative that we will need in the future. And that like, again, it's like in this lesson of like the trans women of color who threw the first brick at Stonewall could be forgotten about for 25 years, right? Like, but they get remembered after 25 years, and then this turns into like our source of inspiration and power now as a story or whatever. That those things can happen, and maybe even 5 years is like too short a time frame. Because I'm like, 5 years, shit, like Boris is still in power, maybe. Like what I would like to see in 5 years is the absolute collapse of the hostile environment and the demolition of the hostile environment. I would like to see trans activism kind of get through a phase in Britain where the kind of like how the reproduction of whiteness in the forms of discourses, which is also in the reproduction of the forms of rights, and like rights as the primary public discourse that we're kind of like reaching out to and using, both in terms of like what we're contesting, what is being contested in this public space, and also like how we talk about trans liberation. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see the whiteness decentered in that, and because I think it is like symptomatic also in the other forms of actual liberation organizing that we're doing, and that's like, that is a problem. Yeah, I want us all to still be alive in 5 years. That's like, you know, like God knows what the next COVID variant's like. But yeah, that also we have like that we keep building the skills that we will need to be alive in 5 years. Because I think also trans people have been leading a lot of the stuff, like trans and queer people have been leading a lot of the forms of support, like especially with queer care, like shout out again to queer care, because we've been doing this already. And so by the time the pandemic hit, we knew what to do, like, because we had some skills. So yeah, more of the above.
No, that was really helpful. Thank you. And I think I'm really glad that you mentioned that as well about the internationalist concerns. I think when we talk about trans liberation in terms of trans migrants, detention, and asylum, which is something we need to touch on today.
And that these are done like in our name on these islands, right? It's like there's so much, and I think it's also just about like how we give that space, how we give how we create space within our political movements for more political actors than might be represented to emerge and to be present and to support and hold that work.
Brilliant, thank you. And then I'll just come to Jules as a sort of like, you're now going to be wrapping up the evening. Look at that, no pressure.
Before I do that, can I ask you what you think? Because you've got a book coming out like any time now, right? What's your What's your take?
What I cleverly do with my book is I'm like, here are some of the problems. Here are some things that I would like to see, but I'm not going to like the solution. That's what you get for being, I'm a writer, not an activist, which is my final clean thing. I mean, like, it is actually does echo a lot of what you said. And I think, I mean, like, we've sort of touched, but like only very briefly, I mean, the healthcare crisis as well. I guess it comes into mutual aid, but obviously there is a growing crisis in UK trans communities around healthcare. And I just feel for people who are trying to access healthcare for the first time now, even in the years since I first did, when it wasn't that great then, the picture is just radically, something really has to give there. And I think, yeah, I think I would like it to see at least a recentering of healthcare as like a core discussion of, both trans mutual care, but if we're going to have allies, if there are going to be people that want to help us, it's about kind of, building, because we have to move away from the gender identity clinic and we're going to have to build something else. So I would love to see some kind of green shoots of an alternative to that. That would be my one contribution, but I agree with all of yours.
Yeah, for sure. An essay which isn't in the collection, but which is in Salvage magazine, which I wrote with Jane Hode, actually, is called Gender Identity Communism, and it's this it's the last time I wrote about Britain, and hopefully this will be the last time ever, and that's just about the NHS and how we can replace it, basically. So that's in Salvage magazine if people want to see my view on healthcare. But I totally agree with you, and like healthcare is one of the reasons like I left Britain. Partially it was for like work prospects, but partially it's just like, Britain is an especially, like the NHS system is an especially dire one for intersex people in all kinds of ways. So that's a large part of why I migrated, or why I stayed out anyway, when I was weighing up the option of returning to it. So politically speaking, like I wouldn't recommend that. I don't think that, if you're like a British depressed trans person, I don't think like leaving for another country is really a long-term solution, because you see in Germany, you see in Spain, both of those countries have had parliamentary bills about self-identification, and they both had the same kind of turfy discourses, actually setting the socialist parties against.
It's really interesting that when you talk to some of the people in Spain or Germany and such, like they say that lots of the discourse has been like translated British essays that get work their way over there. Like they have an international audience. It's really interesting. Like even in Mexico, my friend from Mexico was saying the other day that they're translating lots of stuff.
They literally had a TERFs on tour moment 2 years ago, and they came to Vienna with the same banner, and they went to Poland, to Austria, to a couple of other countries, to every Pride. Incredible. So don't imagine that leaving the country is going to let you escape, but also maybe it's helpful to like cast your eye a bit broader, like maybe buy a collection with international viewpoints and read that or something like that. But concerning Britain, like I don't have an altogether bleak moment, and I do believe that there are still like a lot of people who are creating beautiful things and setting up like interesting networks and trying out new sort of like experiments, like socially, endocrinologically, and whatever else. And I've got this like this little zine tea, which maybe I'll read you a bit from just as a closer. And this is by Laurel Uziel, which is tea. I'm not sure if you can get it from Housmans, but if they don't have it, they should definitely get some in stock. All right. So this is like a reflection on this whole gender situation, and it's got this charming like uterus face that apparently comes from Twitter, but I don't.
Yeah, I've seen it in the wild.
You've seen it in the wild. Okay. I don't follow the right accounts for this kind of material, I guess. So Laurel Uziel says this, captive in semblance, the body cam protruding inwards. There is an image of a shattered contradiction, cuts the lung flesh just across its edge. Bleed out the trace all inside, now public, but it always was. To make the shocks more smooth, less ruptural, the same way that an enemy is made to nature. The law attempts to describe its object even as it makes it. Now everyone must either be the perpetrator or the victim of a hate crime. Things change. This is simultaneously true and violently unutterable. Grammar with its broken neck, one's migration into the many at any level, still splitting, still whole. So don't despair, like just create beautiful things and find beautiful people, and leave the country on holiday. You don't have to migrate. That's what I've got to say. Okay.
No, thanks for that. No, and it was great to end on a reading. It feels like it's like a perfect kind of ending. I think I just wanted to say thank you again to all of the panelists. Like, it's been really great listening to you. Obviously, I just think you're all super smart. It's been a real pleasure to hear your thoughts, and thank you for your generous answers to the questions. I'd really like to thank the audience as well, everyone that's kind of given up like a warm summer's evening to sit in and listen to us talk about transgender Marxism. You could be forgiven for going to a park and drinking or something. And I just wanted to, I wanted to say, obviously, if you haven't bought the book yet, please do, from Housmans. And I'd like to thank as well, just before we go, Nick and Karen from Housmans for organising and hosting this event. And I'm sure, do you want me to I won't get, people can have your social media handles, they'll be somewhere. I'm not going to hand them out in case you don't really want that. Okay, thank you very much for you, everyone, for your time. And hopefully we'll all do another event with Housman soon.
Thank you so much, Shon. Thank you so much, Housman.
Bye.